Let's get into those headlines. I'm joined now by media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth, and the Deputy Executive Director of the IPA, Daniel Wild, who is in Cairns. Welcome to you both. The ABS data out today reports our population has surpassed the 27 million mark for the first time in history. Now, that's due, of course, to another massive jump in overseas migration. Despite all the promises to rein in migration, the government's already hit 98% of its net migration target for this fiscal year. There's still got a quarter to go, meaning it's not going to get those numbers under control. Sophie, in March alone, that March quarter, we saw migration eclipse natural population growth by more than 4 to 1. It's not coming down, is it?
Well, it certainly isn't, Peter. And I guess the questions that need to be asked is how is Australia going to cope with this? We already have a housing problem, a supply problem, and then looking at other things like infrastructure, hospitals, transport, public transport, roads, etc. So I really believe this will probably be a hot topic in the run-up to the federal election because migration is always a controversial topic to go into the election, and we know that Peter Dutton speaks on this issue a lot. And it's also an issue that we've seen overseas. We've seen this issue with migration in America and in Europe as well. So I think this will become more and more critical as we lead up to the federal election.
Daniel, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Costa was on with my colleague Andrew Bolt last night. He had this to say.
This government has failed, and it's not just Albanese. We've always known he's not strong on policy. He's been a slogan peddler for all the time I've known him. What disappoints me is the Treasurer, the Federal Treasurer. I mean, he's a bloke that did a PhD on Keating and is systematically overturning every single reform of the Hawke-Keating government. It's a Frankenstein government here, a combination of Whitlam and the worst elements of Rudd.
Whitlam and Rudd. I tell you what, you've been in Cairns today with the Prime Minister. He copped it from Bill Kelty the other day, and now you've got another Labor man in Michael Costa. It's clearly not happy families inside the ALP, is it?
Well, that's exactly right, Peter. I think a lot of the hard heads within Labor have known that the government's been going south ever since the Voice to Parliament referendum, which they lost by 60% of Australians voting no to that. And it's been downhill ever since. When we look at the migration and housing crisis, it continues to get worse. As you know, we've had 6 consecutive quarters of negative per capita economic growth. That is the longest decline to living standards that Australians have had on record, and those records go back to the early 1970s. As you just outlined earlier, the figures out today just reinforce the fact that the government is not in control of this program. We want to be a welcoming nation. We want to be a nation that can bring in more migrants, but there's 3 things that need to be met. It must be planned for, it must have the consent of the community, and it must be targeted towards areas of economic need. That hasn't been happening. Clearly, it hasn't been planned for because of the housing crisis. The community no longer supports the mass migration program because most want a cut, not an increase. And it's not being targeted towards areas of economic need because we've still got highly elevated levels of worker shortages despite almost 1.3 million migrants entering on a net basis since this government came in, not to mention all of the social problems. So, look, things just get bad to worse on that front, Peter.
Other data out today, unemployment holding steady at 4.2% for the month of August. That's pretty much dampened any hope we might have had of an interest rate cut from the RBA this year. But over in the United States overnight, the Fed cut rates by 0.5 percentage point. Inflation's cooling there. In the UK, their inflation's sitting at just 2.2%. Now, we're the outlier here, Sophie, but if you listen to Jim Chalmers, he says everything's fine.
Well, they really have to. The government have to say everything's fine, Peter, but it's clearly not. And that interest rate cut over in America is really interesting that it's dropped 0.5 percentage point. And now the focus is on what the RBA will do. But the expectation when they meet next Tuesday is that there will be no rate cut. And as you know, we've had, I think we're up to 13 rate rises, in recent years. And people are starting to turn to the government and questioning why have we had so many rate rises and why are we no better off? Because that is what we were promised at the last election. So this is going to become more and more critical again in the lead up to the election, because people will start focusing on what the government are doing and why aren't we better off now?